There is something wrong with the human body. Not wrong in the way a doctor means when he reads a chart and frowns. Not wrong in the way that sounds like a headline built to frighten you. And not wrong in the way conspiracy theorists mean when they point at a blurry photograph and ask you to squint. Wrong in a quieter, stranger way. Wrong in the way a machine is wrong when you open it up and find 3 of its functions switched off. Not broken, not missing. Switched off. The wiring for them still there. Coiled inside. Intact. Soldered in place. Connected to nothing. The body you are sitting in right now is full of that wiring. Structures with no agreed purpose. Organs that the textbooks call vestigial, which is the polite word for a thing we cannot explain and have decided to stop asking about. Long stretches of genetic code that do nothing at all, that are labeled silent or junk or non-coding, as if a living thing would carry, in every single cell, instructions it never uses, for no reason, forever. A brain that fires across a fraction of what it contains. A lifespan that ends decades before the body's own repair systems were built to give out. You have been told that all of this is normal. You have been told it so completely, and from so early, that you have never once stopped to ask whether a body full of switched-off equipment is the sign of a creature that evolved, or the sign of a creature that was modified. The official explanation is evolution. Leftovers. The junk that a few million years of blind trial and error leaves lying around inside a living thing. The way an attic fills with objects no one remembers bringing home. And in many cases, that explanation is reasonable, and I am not going to insult you by pretending it is worthless. But there is another explanation, an older one, and it does not say that these silent systems are forgotten clutter that evolution never bothered to throw away. It says, very precisely, that they are equipment. Equipment that was installed and then deliberately turned off. 4,000 years before the first geneticist looked at the first strand of human DNA. Before anyone had the word for a gene. Before any civilization we officially recognize as scientifically literate existed at all. There were people writing about exactly this. They were writing it down on wet clay, with a sharpened reed, in a language most of the world has forgotten, in the flat marshland between 2 rivers in what is now southern Iraq. And what they wrote was not a myth about heroes and monsters. It was closer to a maintenance record, a technical document. They wrote that the human being was made, built, assembled deliberately, with intention and for a purpose, by beings they called the Anunnaki, a word that means, most directly, those who from heaven came down to earth. And they wrote that the first version of the human being, the original, the prototype that came out of that workshop before anything was changed, could do things that you cannot do. Not magic, not superstition, not the wishful exaggeration of a frightened people. Abilities. Specific, listed, repeatedly described abilities that the texts say were standard equipment in the first human beings, and that are not present in us. And the texts are equally specific, equally calm, about why they are not present in us. The difference between what the first humans were and what we are now is not, in their telling, the slow climb of evolution upward toward something better. It is the exact opposite. It is subtraction. Something was taken out, switched off, removed by the same hands that built us, on purpose, for a reason. And the reason, when you finally reach it at the bottom of this list, is the most unsettling thing in the entire record of the human race. This is that record. All of it. The tablets, the translations, the places where modern science has, slowly and almost against its own will, begun to confirm what those clay tablets said. 8 abilities the Sumerian texts describe as original human equipment. 7 of them switched off in 7 different ways. Dimmed, closed, gated, erased, sealed, cut off, and damaged. And 1 The eighth, the last, the one the tablets circle around with something that reads almost like fear, removed completely, not because it was useless, but because it was the one ability that made us dangerous to the ones who made us. Before we begin, one thing, and I want you to actually hear it rather than let it slide past. If you have ever had the feeling, and almost everyone who finds their way to a video like this one has had it, usually late, usually alone, usually in a silence they could not explain, the feeling that you are capable of more than you are able to reach, that there is a memory sitting just behind the memory you can actually find, that you used to know something, or used to be able to do something, and that it has been taken from you, and that you cannot even name what it was, only the shape of the hole where it used to be. If you have ever felt that, then this video is going to put words to that feeling, one by one, 8 times over. Hit subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, because this is the first in a series, and the algorithm does not show this kind of thing to anyone unless they tell it, clearly, that they want it. Subscribe, and you will not miss what comes next. Because there is a great deal that comes next. We are going to go through all 8, slowly, one at a time, the way you would walk down a list held in front of you in the dark. We are going to look at what each ability was, how the Sumerians described it, where it still shows up, switched off, buried in your own biology and your own behavior, and what the older texts say happened to it, who took it, and how, and most importantly, why. And by the end, you're going to understand something that, once you understand it, you cannot stop seeing. You are going to understand why the first humans were built with all 8, and why we were not allowed to keep them. The first ability is the one they wrote about most, and it is the one they took back first, because it was the foundation that all the other thefts were built on top of. The first ability is time, not strength, not speed, not anything you would put on a child's list of superpowers, just time, the simple, staggering ability to keep on living. The Sumerian texts are clear about this, and they are clear in a way that has quietly embarrassed scholars for over a century, because the numbers they give are not poetic numbers, not round symbolic flourishes. They are written down the way you would write down an inventory. They say that the first human beings, the originals, the ones who came out of the workshop before anything was changed, did not live for 70 years, or 80, or even 100. They lived for centuries. And the kings who ruled in the very first age, before the great flood that divides the entire ancient record into a before and an after, did not live for centuries. They lived for thousands of years. You already know where this is written, even if you have never heard its name. It is called the Sumerian King List. And the first thing to understand about it is what kind of document it is, because the official explanations all depend on you misunderstanding that. It is not a legend whispered around a fire. It is not the vision of a single prophet. It is an administrative record, a dry official ledger of who ruled, in which city, and for how long, copied and recopied by professional scribes across centuries, in exactly the tone a government uses to keep track of its own history. And in its oldest section, the part that deals with the time before the flood, it lists 8 kings across 5 cities, and it gives their reigns in plain numbers. The first king, named Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. The king after him ruled for 36,000. The shortest reign in that entire first age was 18,600 years. 8 kings. A combined reign of 241,000. 200 years. And then, the list says, in a single flat line that lands like a door closing. Then, the flood swept over the earth. And after the flood, when, in the words of the list, kingship descended from heaven a second time. The numbers fall off a cliff. The reigns drop from tens of thousands of years to mere thousands, and then to hundreds, and then, generation by generation, down and down, until they settle into the ordinary human lifespans that you would recognize today, the same 70 or 80 years that you have quietly assumed are simply what a human life is. The document is not describing a gradual decline. It is describing a fall, a long age of enormous life, a catastrophe, and then a permanent collapse from which the human being never recovered. The official explanation arrives, as it always does, quickly and confidently, and it arrives in two forms. The first is that the numbers are symbolic, boasts, the swagger of a young civilization inflating the glory of its founders, the way every culture inflates its origins. The second is that they are a counting error, that the Sumerians used a number system built on 60 rather than 10, and that somewhere in the translating, a scribe or a modern scholar multiplied where he should have divided, and the thousands are really just a misplaced decimal. These are reasonable arguments. They are the arguments of careful people, and I want to be fair to them, because they allow a serious scholar to read the king list, note the impossible numbers, give a small, tired smile, and move on with his afternoon. But here is what makes this stranger, and here is what those careful people tend to walk past very quickly. The Sumerians were not the only ones who wrote it down. Open the book of Genesis, turn to the 5th chapter, and you will find the very same document, in a different language, kept by a different people, on the other side of a desert. It is a genealogy of the first men, before the flood, and it gives their ages at death, one after another, in the same flat administrative tone. Adam lived 930 years. Seth, his son, 912. Enosh, 905. And the oldest of them all, Methuselah, lived 969 years. And then, read on, in the very same book, after the flood, the lifespans begin to fall. Not all at once, but steadily, generation by generation, from the 900s down to the 400s, down to the 200s, and finally to a verse where a number is named as a hard ceiling, where it is written that the days of man shall be 120 years, and a limit is drawn that has held over the human race ever since. Sit with what you are looking at. Two civilizations, separated by language, by distance, by centuries, by religion, by everything. And they are preserving the same impossible claim, in the same impossible order, with the same turning point in the middle. Enormous lifespans in the beginning. A catastrophe, a flood at the center, and a sudden, permanent collapse of human life afterward. When one ancient people records a strange thing, you are entitled to call it a myth, a fantasy, a story they told to feel important. But when two ancient peoples, who did not coordinate, who in many ways did not even know each other, record the same strange thing, in the same sequence, with the same flood standing at the exact hinge between the long life and the short one, then you are no longer looking at a myth. You are looking at two independent copies of a single memory, and two independent copies of the same memory is what historians, in every other context, call corroboration. This is not fringe reinterpretation, and I want to be careful to keep saying that, because the reflex is to dismiss this as the talk of cranks. The king list is real. It sits, in fragments, in real museums, cataloged and studied by serious people. The Genesis genealogy has been read aloud in houses of worship for 3,000 years and printed in billions of books. There is nothing fringe about the documents. What is fringe, what no one will say at the front of the lecture hall, is the single most obvious question, the question a child would ask before a scholar trained himself out of asking it. What if the numbers are not exaggerated? What if they are not a counting error? What if the first humans really did live that long, and something happened and we lost it? Because the Sumerians did not merely record that the long life existed. They recorded in detail how it was taken away. There is a text older than the Bible, older than the version of the flood story you grew up with, that scholars call the myth of Adapa. And Adapa, in this text, is the first man, in some readings the very first human being, the god Enki ever made. The prototype, the working model from which every other human was later copied. He is described as wise, as capable, as the pattern of humanity. And in the story, Adapa is summoned up out of the world and into the heavens, into the house of the highest god, Anu. And there, in that house, he is offered two things. He is offered the bread of life and the water of life. Eat the bread, drink the water, and you will live forever. You will live the way the gods themselves live, without end. It is placed in front of him. The immortality that was meant for the human race, sitting on a table, within reach of the first man's hand. And he refuses it. He pushes it away. And here is the detail that turns the whole story from a tragedy of chance into something far colder. He refuses it because Enki, the same god who made him, his own maker, has warned him in advance not to eat or drink anything offered in that house. Enki has told him that what he will be offered is the bread of death and the water of death, and that to accept it is to die. So Adapa, the first man, faithful and obedient to the God who built him, declines the bread of life because his maker told him it was poison. And it was not poison. It was the very thing. And the immortality that was meant for all of humanity is withdrawn in that room because the first man did exactly what his maker told him to do. The text says that Anu, the high god, looks at him and is almost amused, and asks him why. Why he refused, why he chose death for himself and for all the human beings who would ever come after him. And there is no second chance. The bread is taken away. The offer does not come again. And every human being born since has lived and died under the limit that was set in that room. Now stop and look very carefully at what that story is actually telling you, because it is easy to let it slide by as just another old tale of a man who missed his chance. It is not saying that human beings were always meant to be mortal. It is saying the precise opposite. It is saying that immortality, or something very near to it, the long life, was the original specification, the intended design, the standard equipment, and that it was lost, not through human sin, not through a fair test failed, but through an act of deliberate withholding, engineered by the very being who built the man. The God who made Adapa is the same God who made certain Adapa would never reach the bread of life. The Maker, with his own hands, made sure his creation stayed mortal. The Maker threw the switch, and the texts are not ashamed of this. Do not soften it. Do not apologize for it. They record it the way they record the price of grain. If you are starting to feel the shape of this, that something was given and then taken, that the taking was not an accident but a decision, that the ones who did the taking were the very ones who did the making, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because I am going to tell you right now, before we are even one ability deep, that every single thing on this list ends the same way. The same gift, the same withdrawal, the same fingerprints on the same switch, and the pattern only becomes undeniable, only becomes impossible to argue with, once you have seen all 8 of them lined up in a row. The algorithm will not carry this to you on its own. You have to reach back and tell it that you want it. Here is where it stops being only an old story and starts being something the laboratories are confirming. Because modern biology has spent the last half-century quietly proving the one thing the Adapa story depends on, that aging in the human body is not simply wearing out. That death is not only the slow accumulation of random damage, the way a car rusts. It is, at least in part, a program, a schedule, a setting that was chosen. Inside almost every cell in your body, there's a structure called a telomere, a protective cap on the end of each chromosome, often compared to the little plastic tip on the end of a shoelace, the thing that keeps it from fraying. And every single time one of your cells divides to make a new cell, that cap gets a little shorter. A little is shaved off. Every division, your whole life. And when the telomere has been worn down to almost nothing, the cell stops dividing. It does not die of an accident. It retires. It enters a state biologists call senescence, a kind of biological old age, and then it dies on schedule. This is not damage inflicted from the outside. It is a counter, built in, ticking down from the moment you were born, in nearly every cell, all at once. Your body is not simply failing as the years pass. It is counting them. There's a hard limit on the number of times a normal human cell will divide before it shuts down. It even has a name, the Hayflick limit, after the man who discovered it. And when researchers first described that limit, they were describing, in the cold, precise language of the laboratory, the exact same thing the Sumerians described in the language of the gods. There is a number. The number was set, and when you reach the number, your time is finished. And here is the part that should make you sit forward in your chair. We now know that the counter can be reset. There is an enzyme in the body, called telomerase, whose entire job is to rebuild telomeres, to wind the counter back up, to lengthen the caps again, to undo the ticking. Certain of your cells already use it. The cells of the very young use it. And the question that modern science is now circling, slowly, carefully, in extremely measured language, is the precise question the Sumerians answered 4,000 years ago without a moment's hesitation. What would happen to a human being whose counter never ran down? What is the true, natural lifespan of our species if the limit were simply lifted? Nobody has the final answer, but the framework itself, the idea that human lifespan is governed by a built-in switch, a programmed setting that could, in principle, be set to a different value, is no longer the talk of cranks. It is in the journals. It is the subject of serious, funded research. It is the frontier of the science of aging. The Sumerians put the same claim on a clay tablet, and we filed it under mythology. And now we are rediscovering it under a microscope and calling it a breakthrough. So how did they know? That is the question you must keep asking, at the end of every ability, because it is the question that has no comfortable answer. How did a people with no microscopes, no concept of a cell, no way to see a chromosome or measure an enzyme or even imagine such things, arrive at the precise, specific claim that human lifespan is a set limit rather than a natural ceiling? And not only that it is set, but that it was reduced deliberately by an external hand. You do not arrive at that by watching people grow old. Watching people grow old teaches you, at most, that everyone dies at roughly the same age, that life is short, that the grave waits for all. It does not, it cannot, teach you that the age was chosen, that it used to be longer, that it was cut down on purpose, by someone, for a reason. That is not the kind of thing observation can give you. That is not an inference a shepherd makes from watching his elders die. That is testimony, the testimony of a people who were told, by the very beings they called their makers, what had been done to them, and why it had been done. And the why is the part the king list hands you without flinching, if you simply read it in the order it gives. The long life belongs to the time before the flood, the time when, in the Sumerian telling, the Anunnaki were present on the earth, walking on it, managing it directly, standing in the field, giving orders, and the human beings they had built were new, freshly made, still carrying every one of their original specifications intact. The collapse of lifespan comes after the catastrophe, after the relationship between the makers and the made was broken, after, in text after text after text, the gods looked at the human population they had created and decided that it had grown too numerous, too loud, too difficult to keep in line. In one of the oldest versions of the flood story, far older than the story of Noah, and almost certainly its ancestor, the chief god, Enlil, does not send the flood because human beings have sinned. He sends it because they are too loud. There are simply too many of them, living too long, multiplying too fast, and their noise rises up and disturbs his rest. And his solution, debated in a council of the gods, is to thin the herd and to shorten the leash. The flood is one method of doing that. The shortened lifespan is the other, and it is the more lasting of the two. Because think it through, the way the makers must have thought it through. A workforce that lives for centuries is a workforce that accumulates. It accumulates skill. It accumulates wealth. It accumulates memory. The dangerous, dangerous habit of remembering across enough years. Who did what, to whom, and why, and how things really came to be. A man who lives 900 years remembers the making of the world. He remembers the makers. He remembers the day the bread of life was offered and withdrawn. But a workforce that lives 70 years forgets almost everything every 2 generations. It has to be retaught from the beginning, over and over, ignorant child after ignorant child. And it never, ever lives long enough to grow into a real threat, to accumulate enough across a single life to look its makers in the eye. The short life is not cruelty for its own sake. It is crowd control. It is the management of a workforce by the simple expedient of making sure that workforce dies before it learns too much. That is the logic sitting underneath the number on the tablet. The long life was not taken because the gods were sadists. It was taken because it was inconvenient. Because an immortal servant is no servant at all, but a rival in waiting. A creature built to labor is far easier to manage when it is mortal, when its memory is short, when each new generation arrives knowing nothing and dies before it learns too much. The limit on your years is not a flaw in the design of the human being. It is not an unfortunate accident of biology. It is a deliberate feature, installed on purpose, for a reason, by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. The bread of life is still sitting on that table in the oldest story we possess. The first man pushed it away, on the direct instructions of the one who built him, and the counter inside your cells has been ticking down ever since, toward a number you did not choose, set by a hand that long ago left the room. That is the first ability. The first thing they switched off. And understand, it is the gentlest of the 8. It is the one that only steals your time. The next one is stranger, and it does not steal your time. It steals the company you were never supposed to lose. Because the next ability is about who you used to be able to hear. The second ability is a voice. Not your own voice. Not the quiet narration running through your head right now as you take in these words. The inner monologue you know to be your own. A different voice. One that did not feel as though it came from you, because according to the texts, it did not. The Sumerian writings describe something that, to a modern ear, sounds immediately like madness, and they describe it as the most ordinary, expected, universal thing in the world. They describe a time when a human being did not have to stand alone in the dark and agonize over what to do. Did not have to weigh every choice in solitude. Did not have to guess at the will of the gods, the way you guess at the future. Because the gods in that age simply told you, directly, out loud, in a voice the person heard as plainly as you would hear a stranger speaking close behind your shoulder. And every Sumerian had one. This is the thing that should stop you. It was not reserved for kings and priests. The texts speak of a personal God, your God, the one assigned to you specifically, distinct from the great gods of the city and the great gods of the sky. Your personal God went with you, everywhere, your whole life. It guided your decisions. It warned you away from danger before the danger arrived. It spoke to you at exactly the moments when a choice had to be made, and you did not know which way to turn. And the texts do not treat this as a charming metaphor for conscience, not as a poetic way of dressing up a gut feeling. They treat it as a literal, functioning channel of communication, as real and as practical as a road or a well. When a man's life went well, the explanation was that he had listened to his God, kept close to his God, heeded the voice. And when a man's life fell apart, the explanation was specific, and it is one of the most haunting phrases to survive from the ancient world. His God had grown silent. His God had stepped away from him. The voice had stopped. The official explanation is the one you would predict, and it is not a stupid one. Primitive people, the argument goes, had not yet developed the concept of a private inner self, and so they externalized their own thoughts. They heard their own impulses arising in their own minds, and, lacking any framework for an inner life, attributed those impulses to invisible beings standing outside them. It is a tidy theory. It quietly disposes of the personal God by turning him into a misunderstanding. Early humans hearing their own thinking and mistaking it, in their innocence, for someone else's speech. But here's what makes this stranger. One of the most serious minds in the history of modern psychology looked at this exact phenomenon and proposed, in complete and rigorous seriousness, that the ancient people were not mistaken at all, that they really did hear voices, that the human brain itself, 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, was organized in a way that yours is not, and that this older organization produced, as a matter of normal daily function, precisely what the Sumerians described. His name was Julian Jaynes, a psychologist at Princeton, and the idea he spent his life building is known as the bicameral mind. Bicameral simply means two chambers. Jaynes argued that in the ancient world, the two halves of the human brain were not yet integrated, not yet fused into the single continuous self that you experience as you. One half of the brain generated commands, and generated them not as silent thoughts, but as an actual, heard, hallucinated voice. And the other half of the brain received those commands and obeyed them. The person living inside this arrangement did not feel as though he were deciding anything. He felt as though he were being told. And he attributed the telling, naturally and inevitably, to a god. Because what else would you call a clear, authoritative, external voice that arrives in your head at the moment of decision and tells you what to do? Jaynes went back through the very oldest texts that survive on Earth, and he found something extraordinary, hiding in plain sight. The characters in the oldest layers of human writing do not deliberate the way you and I deliberate. They do not sit and weigh options and argue with themselves. They wait. They wait until the voice speaks, and then they act. And he found, tracing forward through the centuries, that somewhere around 3,000 years ago, in text after text, across multiple separate civilizations, the voices begin to go quiet. And a brand new kind of literature appears in human history. A literature of people complaining, grieving, crying out that the gods no longer speak to them. A literature of abandonment. A literature of loss. And that literature is not something Jaynes invented to prop up his theory. You can read it for yourself. There are Babylonian poems. One of the most famous is known by its opening line, which translates as something close to, "I will praise the Lord of wisdom," in which a righteous, faithful man cries out in bewilderment and pain that his God has abandoned him, that the channel has gone dead, that he prays and prays and prays, and nothing comes back. There are Sumerian and Babylonian laments built entirely around the horror of a God who has turned his face away and fallen silent. These are not the words of people watching a poetic metaphor lose its charm. These are the words of people describing a sense that has gone deaf, describing the loss of something they used to perceive clearly every day, their whole lives, and that is, suddenly and inexplicably, no longer there. And it happens, in the record, within a specific window of time, late in what we call the Bronze Age, across the entire ancient world, more or less at once, as though a single switch had been thrown for the whole human species. This is not fringe, and I will keep insisting on that, because the instinct is to wave it away. Julian Jaynes was not a crank shouting on a corner. His book is studied in universities. It is argued over, attacked, defended, and taken seriously enough that serious people have spent careers responding to it. What is fringe? What no one will say, standing at the front of the room, is the question that sits underneath both the Sumerian texts and Jaynes's theory, and simply refuses to go away no matter how politely you ignore it. If the voice was real, if human beings genuinely heard it, then where did it go? And if it did not merely fade, but was switched off, the way the long life was switched off, then who reached in and turned the dial down to silence? Because the Sumerians, once again, do not only tell you the voice existed, they tell you it was withdrawn, and they describe the withdrawal as an act, performed by someone, not as an accident that simply befell mankind. The phrase echoes across the texts like a wound that will not close. My God has forsaken me. Not my God has died. Not I have stopped believing in my God. Forsaken. Left. Abandoned, deliberately, by a being who was present and chose to leave. The relationship is described, always, as a connection that the gods maintained, and that the gods, at a certain point, severed. In the older age, the makers spoke to their creatures constantly, guiding them through every difficulty, because the creatures were new and needed direction, and the makers were physically present on the earth and able to give it. And then, in the same arc, following the same shape as everything else on this entire list, the gods withdrew. They withdrew physically, in the texts, retreating from the earth, ascending, going away, and the voice withdrew along with them. What was left behind, on the empty ground, was a human being who, for the very first time in the history of the species, had to face a decision in total silence. Alone, inside his own skull, with no one answering, guessing. And that silence, I want you to understand this clearly. That silence is the thing you are sitting in at this very moment. It feels utterly normal to you because you have never once known anything else. From your first conscious thought, you have been alone in your own head. But the texts insist, flatly and repeatedly, that this is new. That the loneliness of the modern mind, the endless private deliberation, the weighing and reweighing, the second guessing, the lying awake, wondering what you should do while nothing and no one answers, is not the natural, original condition of the human being. It is the condition of a human being whose channel was cut. The aloneness you feel is not the default state of consciousness. It is the symptom of an amputation so old and so universal that we mistook the wound for the way a mind is supposed to be. If you have ever, in a quiet moment, felt that you were almost about to hear something, that there was a voice waiting just on the other side of the silence, that you used to be connected to something larger, and the line went dead long before you were born, then the texts would tell you plainly that you are not imagining it, and you are not unwell. You are remembering, faintly, dimly, an ability that every single one of your ancestors once carried as standard equipment. Subscribe, and stay with me, because the further down this list we travel, the less it sounds like the superstition of frightened primitives, and the more it sounds like exactly what I told you it was at the start: an inventory. A careful, itemized inventory of everything that was removed from the human being in order to make him manageable. Here is where modern science leans in, uneasily, and confirms far more than it is comfortable confirming, because the capacity to hear a voice that is not physically there, to experience a thought as an external, audible, commanding presence, is not gone from the human brain. It is dormant. It is switched off, not removed. And we have a name for what happens when it switches back on in a person living today. We call it auditory hallucination. And in its most organized and persistent form, we call it schizophrenia, and we classify it as a disease, and we medicate it, and we work very hard to make it stop. But look closely, without flinching, at what the so-called illness actually is. The brain generates language in a specific region on the left side. There is a matching mirror image region on the right side that, in most modern people, stays quiet, stays inactive, contributes nothing to speech. But in a person who hears voices, that silent right side region switches on, and it produces speech, real internally generated language, that the rest of the brain does not recognize as its own, and therefore experiences as another person talking. A command from outside, a voice in the empty room, a god. That is not a malfunction invented by the stresses of modern life. That is the old bicameral architecture, still physically present in every single human skull, still wired in, still connected, still fully capable of producing exactly the experience the Sumerians described as the personal god. Except that now, in a brain that has been built and raised for silence, it arrives as terror instead of as guidance, as a symptom instead of as a companion. The hardware did not disappear. It was switched off, and then our entire civilization, our entire definition of sanity, was constructed on top of the unspoken assumption that it must stay off, that to hear the voice is to be broken. And the people in whom it has somehow switched back on, the people we diagnose and medicate and quietly fear, are not, by the old record, the damaged ones. By the old record, they are the ones in whom the channel never fully closed. So how did they know? Ask it again, because the answer keeps getting harder. How did a Bronze Age people identify, with this much precision, that the human mind contains a second, separate source of speech, a voice that feels external, that issues commands, that can be present, and then fall silent, when the brain that produces it would not be mapped, would not even be conceived of for another 4,000 years? You do not discover the architecture of the two-chambered mind by sitting quietly and looking inward. You cannot feel your own right hemisphere. You cannot introspect your way to the knowledge that the voice has a physical source that can be switched off. The only way to know that the voice was a feature of the design, that it had a location, that it could be silenced, is to have been told. By something that knew how you were built, because it had built you. And the why follows the same line as the long life, the same cold managerial logic wearing a slightly different face. A creature that hears the direct, constant voice of its maker is wonderfully obedient, but it is also wholly dependent. It needs the maker present. It needs the maker speaking all the time. The moment the Anunnaki decided they wanted to step back from the earth, to manage their operation from a distance instead of standing in the field, giving spoken orders every hour of every day, the direct voice became a problem. A liability. A workforce that cannot take a single action without first being told what to do is a workforce that can never, ever be left alone. So the channel was narrowed, the voice was withdrawn, and in its place, the makers left behind something that, from their point of view, was a clever solution, and that, from ours, was a deep and permanent wound. A creature that could now decide for itself, alone, in silence, because it had no other choice. We have a name for that creature's new condition. We call it consciousness. We call it free will. We are enormously proud of it. We build our philosophies and our flatteries of the human spirit on top of it. The texts quietly suggest that it is scar tissue, grown thick over the exact place where the voice used to come through, in a creature that was cut loose from its maker and told, in effect, to manage on its own from now on. You have been alone inside your own head for your entire life. You have assumed, without ever once questioning it, that the silence is simply what a mind is. The second ability says otherwise. It says the silence was installed. It says you were not built to bear the weight of every decision by yourself, in the dark, with no one answering. Which is exactly why, in every single culture that descended from that first one in the marshes between the rivers, the human animal has never, not for 1 century, stopped trying to get the voice back. Praying into the quiet, listening at the very edge of sleep, straining in temples and in deserts and in the small hours of the night, toward a presence it half remembers and can no longer quite hear. That is the second ability. The voice they switched off. The first one shortened your years, so you would die before you remembered. This one closed the line so that you would face it all alone. The third one is stranger than either, and it is closer than either, because it is not about your time, and it is not about your mind. It is about your body. About a wound your body was built to be able to close completely, and now, for reasons the texts will explain, can only scar over and leave. The third ability is in your skin right now, as you sit here, and it is asleep. Cut yourself, and your body will close the wound. You already know this. You have watched it happen 100 times. But look at what it actually does, because we have stopped looking. It will close the wound badly. It will lay down scar tissue, a rough, pale, knotted, second-rate patch that is not the same as the skin it replaced. That scar has no sweat glands. It grows no hair. It carries no fingerprint, none of the fine ridged machinery of the original surface. It is a plug. Your body, faced with damage, does not rebuild what was lost. It seals the hole with a cheaper material and moves on, and the mark stays with you for the rest of your life as a small permanent admission that the repair was never really a repair at all. And we accept this. We accept it so completely that we have decided it is simply what living flesh does, the natural and unavoidable limit of biological tissue, the very best that a body can manage. It is not the best a body can manage. And we know with absolute certainty that it is not, because other bodies all around us do far better. A salamander can lose an entire leg. Bone, muscle, nerve, blood vessel, skin, the whole limb torn away, and it will grow it back. Not a scar, not a stump, not an approximation. A new leg, complete and perfect, with every bone in the right place and every muscle correctly attached, and every nerve wired back into the spinal cord, fully functional, indistinguishable from the leg it lost. A creature called the axolotl, a kind of salamander, can regrow not only limbs, but portions of its heart, its spinal cord, even parts of its brain, scarlessly, again and again, throughout its life. A flatworm called the planarian can be cut into a dozen pieces, and each individual piece will regrow from that fragment into a complete and whole new animal, head and all. These are not creatures from a story. They are in laboratories, in classrooms, in tanks of water in university basements, doing this on command, on a schedule, for the cameras. True regeneration, the rebuilding of a complex body part entirely from scratch, is not rare in the animal kingdom. It is ordinary. It is common. It is one of the standard tricks of life on Earth. It is simply one that we, the supposed crown and summit of all creation, the most advanced animal that has ever lived, do not have. The official explanation is, once again, evolution, and once again, it is a respectable story. We traded regeneration away, the argument goes, somewhere on the long road to becoming human, in exchange for other advantages, for a large and complex brain, for warm blood and a fast metabolism, for a long protected childhood in which to learn. The machinery for rebuilding the body was lost, the story says, because in a creature like us, it was no longer worth its enormous cost. A reasonable account. Except for one detail that the reasonable account always seems to hurry past. Eyes down, hoping you will not notice. We did not lose the machinery. We still have it. We are carrying it in every cell right now. It is simply switched off. Every cell in your body holds the complete instructions for building every other part of you. Your eye, your heart, your hand, all of it, written out in full in the DNA of a cell in your earlobe. The genes that a salamander switches on to regrow a severed limb have direct counterparts sitting in your own genome. The deep, ancient genetic toolkit for growing a body from nothing is shared across nearly all animals, and you are carrying the whole set. And here is the proof that it is not gone, only gated. The proof that should be on the front page, and is instead buried in journals. A human embryo in its first weeks in the womb can repair itself completely, scarlessly. It can regrow tissue the way a salamander does, perfectly, leaving no mark. And then, partway through development, before you are even born, that ability shuts down, and never, for the rest of your life, comes back on. It gets worse, or rather, stranger. A human child who loses the very tip of a finger below a certain young age can sometimes regrow it. The fingertip, the nail, the print, even the little cap of bone. The salamander's gift, flickering on for a few short years of childhood, and then the window closes, quietly, and the same injury in an adult produces nothing but a stump and a scar. The capacity is not absent from our species. It is allowed in the womb. It is allowed for one brief season of early childhood. It is allowed, even now, in your liver, which can regenerate a large portion of itself if it is damaged. And everywhere else, in the grown body, in the skin you are sitting in, it is held shut, locked, waiting. But here is what makes this stranger, and here is where the laboratory and the clay tablet reach toward each other across 4,000 years. The Sumerians had a name for the thing that is being held shut inside you. They did not call it a gene, of course. They had no such word. They called it a plant. And they told a story, the oldest long story that survives anywhere on Earth, about a man who held that plant in his own hand and lost it. The story is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written down more than 4,000 years ago. And at its climax, Gilgamesh, a king who has been driven half-mad with terror by watching his closest friend sicken and die, who has seen for the first time that he too will rot and end, sets out on a desperate journey to find the secret of eternal life. And after great trial, he is told of a plant that grows at the bottom of the fresh water, deep beneath the waters, a plant with a name that the text gives as something like the old man becomes young again, a plant that restores a man to the vigor of his youth, the aged body made young, the damage of years undone, the healing the gods had kept for themselves, growing wild within reach. He ties stones to his feet and sinks down into the deep, and he finds it, and he tears it up by its roots, and he holds in his own human hand the cure for aging itself, the regeneration of the human body, the salamander's gift, returned. And he does not eat it on the spot. He decides to carry it home, to share it with the old men of his city, to test it first, a careful, decent, human decision. And on the journey home, hot and tired, he stops to bathe in a cool pool of water. And while he is in the water, a serpent, drawn by the plant's fragrance, slides up out of the ground and seizes the plant, and eats it, and slips away. And as it goes, it sheds its skin, sloughs off its old self, and emerges young and gleaming and new. And the renewal is lost. Lost to Gilgamesh. Lost to his city. Lost to the entire human race, forever. The serpent took it. Which is why, the text explains, a snake can shed its skin and be made young again, and a man cannot. Read what that story is encoding underneath the adventure, because it is staggering. The ability to renew the body, to undo aging, to regrow what time and injury destroy, the salamander's shed and the new perfect limb existed. It was real. It was within reach. It was actually held in a human hand, and it was taken, stolen in the oldest story humanity possesses by a serpent, and anyone who was raised on a different ancient book will feel the floor tilt at that word. The serpent, the same figure, by a pool, in a garden, near the water. A serpent takes from humanity the very thing that would have let us heal and not die, and condemns us, by the theft, to scarring and aging and death, while the serpent itself slides away, shedding its skin, renewed. Two civilizations, the same loss, the same thief, the same shape, recorded twice, independently. The healing was real. It was meant for us, and it was taken by the serpent, near the water, in the beginning. This is not fringe. The Epic of Gilgamesh sits on its clay tablets in the British Museum, among the most studied documents in human history. The regeneration of the salamander sits in every biology textbook printed in the last century. What is fringe, what no one will say standing at the front of the room, is the single line that connects them, the line a child would draw without hesitation. What if the plant of life is not a metaphor? What if it is a memory of an ability the first humans actually had, the salamander's gift, the body that rebuilds itself whole? And the story of the serpent stealing it is the record, dressed in the only language they had, of the precise moment that the gene was switched off. Here's where modern science walks right up to the edge of the pool and stops, staring down into the water. Because researchers who study regeneration have discovered exactly why we do not regrow our limbs, and the reason is not what evolution's tidy story would predict. It is not that we lack the genes. We have established that we carry them. It is that, in us, the wound responds in the wrong way. When a salamander loses a limb, the cells at the wound do something remarkable. They revert. They despecialize, returning to a flexible, embryonic, undecided state, and they gather into a structure called a blastema, a living bud of pure potential. And from that bud, following the body's deep instructions, they rebuild the entire limb from scratch. In a human being, at the very same moment, faced with the very same wound, our cells do something different. They race instead to form scar tissue, to plug, not to rebuild. The regeneration program and the scarring program are both present in you. Both written into your cells, both available, and your body, by default, by a setting, chooses scarring. And the leading edge of modern medicine, right now, in laboratories around the world, is the deliberate attempt to switch a human wound out of the scarring response and into the regeneration response. To wake the blastema. To coax the human body back into the mode it used freely in the womb. They are trying, with everything they have, to turn the ability back on. which means, beyond any argument, that the ability is there to be turned on, which is, word for word, breath for breath, precisely what the oldest story on Earth has been telling us, patiently, for 4,000 years, while we filed it under fairy tales. So how did they know? How did a people with no genetics, no cell biology, no microscope, no concept of a stem cell or a blastema, or a strand of DNA, arrive at the exact, specific claim that the human body contains a dormant capacity for total renewal, a plant of life that was once present, that was lost, and that could in principle be regained? You do not learn that by watching wounds heal. Watching wounds heal teaches you at most that flesh scars and that bodies grow old and fail. It does not, it cannot teach you that there is another setting, a second mode switched off, that the body could be using instead. That is not an observation a healer makes by the bedside. That is the testimony of someone who knew the design, who knew with certainty what the body could do before the program was changed, because they were there when it was changed. And the why, by now, you can almost recite along with me, and it is colder every time you meet it. A workforce that heals like a salamander, that does not scar, that does not age, that cannot be ground down by labor, because it simply repairs itself faster than the work can damage it. That is not a workforce. That is a rival. The entire arrangement between the makers and the made, in text after text, depends on the human being as a thing that is used up, that labors, wears out, breaks down, and is replaced by the next ignorant generation. A creature that repairs itself indefinitely can never be used up. It accumulates. It endures. It outlasts. So the renewal was taken, eaten by the serpent, withheld at the table, sealed away the moment the womb finished its work. And what was left behind in its place was a body that does the one thing a tool absolutely must do if it is to be a tool. It wears out. Your scars are not the natural limit of what your flesh can do. They are the visible mark of the setting your flesh was left on by a hand that needed you breakable. That is the third ability. The first one took your years. The second took the voice. The third took your body's power to make itself whole again. And the fourth is the cruelest of them, and the most important, because it is the one that hides all the others. Because the most efficient way to steal something from a creature is to also steal its memory that it ever had the thing at all. The fourth ability is the one this entire video is quietly fighting against. Because the fourth thing they took from the human being was the memory of the first three. Not your everyday memory, not where you left your keys, not what you ate yesterday, not the name of someone you met last week. A deeper memory than that. The memory of where you come from. The memory of what you actually are. The memory of the long life, and the voice, and the healing, and of the hands that built you, and of the day those same hands reached in and switched it all off, one ability at a time. The Sumerian texts, and the texts that descend from them down the long chain of human writing, return again and again, obsessively, to a single devastating claim, that the human being was made to forget. That forgetting is not a weakness or a flaw in our minds, but a feature deliberately installed in them. That the most important things a person could ever possibly know, who made us, what we once were, and exactly what was done to us and why, were taken out, erased, sealed away, and that we are each of us born already missing the one memory that would explain our own lives to us. The official explanation hardly even needs to be spoken aloud, because it feels like nothing more than common sense. Of course you do not remember being made. Of course you do not remember a time before your own birth, before your own brain existed. There is nothing there to remember. Memory begins when the brain begins, and not a moment before. To speak of a forgotten memory of origin is, the argument goes, simply to speak nonsense. To long to remember something that, by definition, never happened to you in the first place. But here is what makes this stranger. You do forget your own beginning. Demonstrably, measurably, and not at all in the harmless way that common sense assumes. There is a phenomenon that every parent has noticed, and that science has a sober clinical name for. It is called childhood amnesia, or infantile amnesia. You cannot remember being 2 years old. You cannot remember being 1. You cannot remember being born, or the first years of your own life. Years in which you were fully awake, intensely alive, learning faster than you will ever learn again, feeling everything, present for all of it. Those years happen to you, vividly, and they are gone, not faded, not blurry. Gone, sealed off behind a wall that drops in nearly every human being, somewhere around the age of 3. We treat this as ordinary, as unremarkable, precisely because it is universal. Because it happened to everyone, we assume it must be natural. But stop and actually look at it, the way you would look at it if you were seeing it for the first time. The single most formative period of your entire existence. The period in which you learned to understand language, to speak, to walk, to recognize the faces of the very people who would shape the whole rest of your life, is erased from you, wiped. Not dimmed by time, the way an old memory dims, but cut off cleanly, the same way, on the same schedule, in everyone. The human being is, as a simple matter of established fact, a creature whose earliest memories are systematically deleted on a timetable identically across the entire species. The Sumerians would not have found that strange in the slightest. They would have nodded. They would have said, yes, that is the mechanism. That is the very tool. And that is where the rest of it went too. Because they describe the great forgetting as an act, performed deliberately, not as a natural limit of the mind. In text after text, the knowledge that mattered most, the knowledge the gods possessed, the knowledge of how the world was truly made, and how the human was made, and what the human being secretly is described as guarded, withheld, kept deliberately on the far side of a barrier. The great secrets in the Sumerian telling are not lost, the way a careless people loses its history. They are kept. They are held back. And the human being is kept, on purpose, on the wrong side of them. A creature that was given just exactly enough understanding to labor and to obey, and that was carefully, specifically, denied the precise understanding that would let it grasp what it really was. In the story of Adapa, the very same first man who loses the bread of life is also described in the same breath as having been given wisdom but not given eternal life, given just enough to function and denied just enough to remain free. The pattern never changes. Give the tool what it needs to do the work. Withhold the one thing it would need in order to stop being a tool. If you have ever felt, and most people watching this have felt it, in the small hours, in the silence we already named, that there is a memory sitting just behind your memory, something vast and important that you used to know and can no longer reach, a sense that you are walking around your whole life with a hole in you shaped exactly like an answer. Then understand what the oldest texts on earth are telling you, plainly, without flattery and without comfort. You are not imagining the hole. The hole is real. And it is not a defect in you, not a sign of something wrong with your particular mind. It was cut, on purpose, in all of us. Subscribe, and stay with me. because we are now past the halfway point of this descent. And from here on, the abilities stop being merely things you lost, and start being things that, if you still had them, would make you something the makers could not possibly afford to allow to exist. Here is where it stops being only a story, and the science arrives carrying confirmation it would clearly rather not be holding. Because the structure of human memory, as we now understand it, after a century of careful study, turns out to be bizarre in exactly the way that ancient texts predict. Your memories are not stored the way you imagine them stored, not filed away intact in some cabinet in the brain, sitting unchanged, waiting to be opened and replayed. They are reconstructed, rebuilt from scattered fragments, every single time you recall them, by a brain that fills in the missing pieces with plausible guesses and is astonishingly easy to fool. Memory can be edited. Worse, memory can be implanted. Researchers have, in controlled experiments, placed entirely false memories into ordinary people, convinced them they had been lost in a shopping mall as a child, or had committed an act they never committed, until the subjects recalled the invented event vividly, in detail, with total confidence, defending its reality, completely unable to tell the planted memory from a true one. The system that holds your entire sense of your own past is not a vault. It is a workshop, endlessly rewriting its own records. And crucially, this is the part that should stop your breath. It is a workshop that can be written by someone other than you. A mind whose memories are reconstructed rather than stored is a mind whose history can be edited from the outside, and the edit leaves no seam. The texts said the memory of origin was removed. Modern science, reluctantly, says that human memory is precisely, exactly, the kind of system from which a memory could be removed, and the subject would never, ever know that it was gone, because the system would simply close smoothly over the gap and present itself, to itself, as whole and complete and untouched. So how did they know? How did a Bronze Age people identify that human memory is editable, that it has a wall dropped across its own beginning, that the deepest and most important knowledge is sealed off by deliberate design, when the architecture of memory itself would not begin to be understood for thousands of years? You do not discover the editability of memory by remembering harder. The single tool you would have to use to investigate the theft is the very tool that was tampered with. It is like asking a clock that has been deliberately set wrong to tell you that it has been set wrong. The only possible way to know that the memory was taken is to be told by something standing outside the memory, something that watched the erasure happen, because it was the one holding the eraser. And the why is the simplest, and the most total, and the most chilling of all of them. Everything else on this list could be taken. The years, the voice, the healing. But every one of those thefts would fail, would unravel, if the human being merely remembered that the theft had occurred. Because a creature that knows it was robbed will spend its entire existence trying to get the stolen thing back. It will search. It will rebel. It will not rest. So the last and most important removal, the keystone of the whole design, was the removal of the knowledge of all the other removals. Cut the lifespan down, but make them forget that they were ever meant to live longer. Close the voice, but make them forget that they were ever connected to anything. Seal the healing, but make them forget that the plant was ever in their hand. And then, over the top of all of it, lay down the final, deepest erasure. Make them forget that anything was ever forgotten. A workforce that does not remember it was once more than a workforce will never, in 1,000 generations, demand to be more than a workforce. It will labor. It will obey. It will invent flattering stories about how this was always its natural condition. The memory was not taken because it was dangerous to know one particular fact. It was taken because it was the master key, the one key that unlocked every other door, the memory whose loss made all the other losses permanent. That is the fourth ability, the theft that hides the thefts, the wound that erases the record of the wounding. And now that it is named, now that it is spoken aloud, the wall it built has a crack running through it. And the last four abilities will come faster now and land harder because something in you is already beginning, against 4,000 years of careful erasure, to remember. The fifth ability is an eye, and you cannot see out of it anymore. Across the entire ancient world, across Sumer and Egypt and Babylon, and the cultures that grew up afterward in their shadow, one symbol appears again, and again, and again, more often than almost any other image human beings have ever carved. The eye, not a pair of human eyes looking out of a face, a single eye, set alone, watching, knowing. The eye inside the triangle, the eye on the brow of the god, the eye that floats by itself above the scene, that sees what ordinary eyes cannot see. We have inherited that symbol so completely, so thoroughly, that it stares out at us today from the back of currency, from the facades of buildings, from 1,000 places we walk past without a second glance, and we no longer even ask ourselves what it was ever supposed to mean. The ancients were not decorating. They did not spend their precious labor carving the same image into stone, century after century, across separate civilizations, for fun. They were recording something. They were recording an ability, a mode of perceiving the world that did not run through the two eyes in the front of the face, a sight beyond sight. And they located it with striking consistency in a single specific place, the center of the forehead, just above and between the two ordinary eyes. The single eye, the inner eye, the third eye. The official explanation is that this is pure mysticism, that the third eye is nothing more than a poetic image, a figure of speech for insight, for wisdom, for the metaphor of seeing, a truth you cannot literally see. The ancients, the argument goes, were speaking in symbols, dressing up an abstract idea of inner understanding in the borrowed clothing of an organ. There is, after all, no eye in the middle of anyone's head. But here's what makes this stranger. There is. Deep in the center of your brain, almost exactly behind the point that the ancients marked on the forehead, there is a small structure, about the size of a grain of rice, called the pineal gland. And anatomically, it is one of the strangest things in your entire body. It develops, in the embryo, from the same tissue that forms the eye. Let that land for a moment. It grows from eye tissue. In some animals living today, it sits close to the surface of the skull and is genuinely, measurably sensitive to light. A literal third eye, what biologists call a parietal eye, that detects brightness and darkness directly through the top of the head. And in you, it is unpaired. This is the part that should make the hair on your arms move. Your brain is built in mirror image. 2 hemispheres. 2 of nearly everything, left and right, matched and doubled all the way down. The pineal gland is the great exception. It is single, solitary, the one unpaired structure sitting in the exact center of an organ that is otherwise perfectly doubled. One thing, alone, in the middle of all that symmetry. Exactly, precisely as the ancients drew it. One eye, alone, in the center. The philosopher Descartes, thousands of years after the Sumerians, looked at this single central structure in the doubled brain and was so unsettled by it that he declared it the seat of the soul, because he could not imagine why else the brain would contain one solitary thing in the middle of all that mirrored pairing. The ancients did not need to open a skull and find it. They marked its location on the outside of the forehead, and called it the eye that sees what the eyes cannot. And they said very clearly that it could be opened. And they said just as clearly that it could be closed. The texts describe forms of perception that we would call frankly impossible. Knowing what is happening at a great distance, with no messenger, sensing what is coming before it arrives, perceiving the true intentions of the gods themselves. And they treat this not as fantasy, but as a faculty, something that the gifted possessed, something that in the older age was far more common than it later became, something that fades, that dims, that can be lost. And what is most extraordinary, the thing they should not have been able to know, is that they spoke of a reason the inner eye closes. Because the pineal gland in the modern human body does something that the ancients had no possible way to observe, and that we have now measured in millions of skulls. It calcifies, it hardens. Over the course of a lifetime, and increasingly, and earlier, in the modern industrialized world, for reasons involving the chemicals in our water and our food that we are only beginning to argue about. The pineal gland accumulates deposits of calcium. It literally begins to turn to stone. It develops a hard, mineral, bony shell, so reliably and so commonly that radiologists actually use the calcified pineal as a convenient landmark when reading brain scans, because it shows up as a bright, hard, white spot, sitting right in the center of nearly every adult human head. The single eye, the seat of the soul, the organ the ancients said was the gateway to the sight beyond sight. And in the modern human being, slowly, year by year, it turns to bone. This is not fringe. The pineal gland is in every anatomy textbook ever printed. Its calcification is documented in every radiology department on Earth. You can go and look at the scans. What is fringe? What no one will say standing at the front of the room is the question that the two facts, laid side by side, force into the open and will not let go. If the ancients, with no anatomy, located an organ of inner sight in precisely the spot where we now find a singular, eye-derived, light-sensitive structure that slowly hardens and shuts itself down over the course of a lifetime, were they really just spinning a pretty metaphor? Or were they describing an organ that used to work in a body that was newer and cleaner than ours, and that has since been allowed, or made, to seal itself shut behind a wall of stone? And the gland does one further thing that the ancients seem to have understood, and that we are only now, carefully, beginning to study. It is intimately bound up with the very deepest states of human consciousness, with the threshold of sleep, with the chemistry of dreaming, with the strange and powerful compounds the brain produces at the very edges of life, at birth and at death. The ancients said the inner eye opened onto another world entirely. The gland sits at exactly the junction where this world and that inner world appear to meet. And it is the one part of you that visibly, measurably, undeniably hardens shut as you age, as though a window were being slowly bricked over from the inside, a little more mortar laid each year in a body that was once meant to keep that window clear and open to the light. So how did they know? How did a people with no way to open a living skull and find a structure the size of a grain of rice buried in the dead center of the brain know to mark that exact point on the outside of the forehead, draw it as a single solitary eye, and call it the organ of a sight that the outer eyes do not possess? You do not find the pineal gland by looking inward. You cannot feel it. You have no sensation of it whatsoever. The only conceivable way to point at it, to know that it is single in a doubled brain, to know that it is derived from an eye, to know that it is a gate to another kind of seeing, is to have been shown the blueprint, by something that drew the blueprint, by something that built the body and knew where every part was placed and what every part was for. And the why, by now, you could speak along with me in the dark. A creature that can see at a distance, that can sense what is coming, that can perceive the real intentions of the very beings who rule over it. That creature cannot be deceived. It cannot be ambushed. It cannot be managed by the simple, essential trick of hiding things from it. Because the sight beyond sight is, above and beyond all its other uses, the ability to see through the lie. And a managed workforce, more than anything else in the world, must not be able to see through the lie it is being managed by. So the window was allowed to harden. The eye was allowed to turn to stone. And the human being was left with two outer eyes that see only surfaces, only the skins of things, in a world that grows, year by year, more carefully arranged to make sure that even the gland we have left calcifies faster and earlier and harder. And the rare ones in whom it has somehow stayed clear, stayed open, we call intuitive or sensitive or gifted or unsettling. And we have built no place for them, and we have never once stopped to ask the obvious question of why it should be a rare and suspect gift to use an organ that every single human skull on Earth still carries, sealed in its exact center. That is the fifth ability, the eye they let turn to stone. The sixth is its near twin, and it follows it like a shadow. Not the power to perceive what is hidden, but the power to know what was never taught. The sixth ability is knowledge that does not have to be learned. Watch a newborn animal, and you are watching something miraculous that we have grown too familiar with to see. A foal, a baby horse, slides out into the world, and within 1 hour of having never existed, it stands on its 4 impossible legs, and it walks. No one taught it. A sea turtle hatches alone on a beach at night, having never seen its mother, having never seen another turtle, having never seen the sea, and it turns, without instruction, toward the water, and it enters the ocean, and then it navigates across thousands of miles of featureless open sea to a specific feeding ground it has never been to. And years later it returns, across that same trackless ocean, to the exact stretch of the exact beach where it was born, to lay its own eggs. No one taught it any of this. No one could have. The knowledge is simply there, present, complete, fully formed, from the very first moment of life. Downloaded, you might fairly say, rather than learned. And the human being, alone among all the animals, the great glaring exception, arrives knowing almost nothing, helpless for years, unable to stand, to walk, to feed itself, to survive for an hour on its own, forced to acquire absolutely everything, slowly, painfully, one hard-won fact at a time, building knowledge from nothing across an entire long childhood, and then continuing to build it across an entire life, and dying, every one of us, with the work still unfinished, having barely begun. We have been taught to call this our crowning glory, our open-ended learning, our infinite flexibility, the blank slate that can become anything. The Sumerians would have called it a wound. They would have looked at the foal that walks in an hour and the child that cannot walk for a year, and they would have said, simply, "You were not always like this. You used to know." The official explanation is that complex knowledge requires a complex brain, and a complex brain requires a long, slow, open childhood in which to wire itself up through experience. We trade raw instinct for flexible intelligence. We are born knowing nothing precisely so that we can learn to become anything. It is a clean and reasonable story, except that it leaves one enormous thing completely unexplained. The single strangest event in the entire human record, and the Sumerians are standing directly in the center of it, pointing, because civilization did not begin slowly. It did not creep up gradually over uncounted millennia of patient trial and error. It began suddenly, almost violently, fully formed in Sumer, and it began with a claim about precisely this ability, the gift of knowledge from outside. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, mapped and recorded, law, codified, agriculture, organized, monumental architecture, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, and the hour into 60 minutes, a system born in Sumer that still rules the clock on your wall and the device in your hand this very moment. These things do not appear in the Sumerian record as the slow accumulation of 1,000 small discoveries across 10,000 years. They appear in the archaeological and the textual record both almost all at once as a single package near the very beginning, with no long ramp of gradual development visible behind them. Historians have a quiet, uncomfortable name for the discomfort this causes. Some of them have called it simply the Sumerian problem, a people seemingly without predecessors, producing, in a startlingly compressed window of time, the entire foundation of human civilization. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The Sumerians themselves did not take the credit. This is almost unheard of among peoples. They did not say, "We invented these things." They said, "These things were given to us." And they told the story of the giving, plainly, in detail. In the beginning, they said, before civilization, the human beings lived like animals, naked, ignorant, knowing nothing, eating grass, drinking from ditches. And then beings came. They called them the Apkallu, the seven sages. And the historian Berossus, a Babylonian priest who set the old traditions down in Greek, described them as figures who emerged from the waters of the sea, beings part fish and part man, possessed of overwhelming knowledge. And these beings gave to humanity everything. The first of them, a being Berossus calls Oans, came up out of the sea and taught mankind writing and mathematics and the working of metals and the building of cities and temples and the laws and the surveying of land and the observation of the heavens. The entire apparatus of civilization handed over to a creature that had known nothing. And, the texts are careful to say, they did not teach it the way a patient schoolmaster teaches, one lesson at a time across years. They delivered it. They handed over the whole working apparatus of civilization, complete, to a creature freshly raised from ignorance, and then they withdrew back into the waters from which they had come. And the first of these sages, in some of the oldest tellings, is Adapa himself. The same first man, the same model human, the prototype, here cast as the one who received the great download of knowledge directly from the hand of the god Enki. The knowing was given, from the outside, complete, all at once. This is not fringe. The sudden, anomalous, almost vertical flowering of Sumerian civilization is acknowledged by every serious historian alive. They argue only about how to explain it, never about whether it is strange. The Apkallu are in the texts, carved on the walls, named on the tablets. Berossus is in the record, quoted and preserved. What is fringe, what no one will say standing at the front of the room, is the very simplest reading of what the Sumerians said repeatedly about themselves, that the knowledge of civilization did not rise up out of the human mind through slow effort, that it came in from outside the human mind, delivered, complete, and that the reason we now have to learn everything the slow, brutal, one fact at a time way, across a childhood, across a lifetime that runs out before we are anywhere near finished, is that the channel through which knowledge could once simply be given, poured in directly, was, like every other channel on this entire list, deliberately closed. If your skin is moving, if you can feel the pattern locking into place now, the same single hand resting on every switch, the same gift, the same withdrawal, the same careful downgrade of a creature that was once given everything directly and is now made to crawl toward everything alone, in the dark, forgetting as it goes, then you already understand in your body why this channel exists and why most channels never will. Subscribe. Turn on the bell. There are only 2 abilities left to name, and the very last one is the reason that all of the others, every single one, had to be taken. Here is where modern science leans in, reluctantly, and admits more than it would like to. Because the question of inherited knowledge, of knowledge present in a mind that was never put there by learning, is no longer a settled or a comfortable one. We know beyond any argument that animals carry vast and intricate behaviors, entire migrations, recognitions, courtships, constructions, encoded in their genes, present and complete at birth, never taught by any parent. We know that the human brain itself does not arrive as the blank slate of the old story, that it comes pre-structured, pre-wired, preloaded with the deep scaffolding of language, of number, of the recognition of faces, capacities that are not built up from scratch through experience, but that unfold on schedule from something that was already there, waiting, written in. The psychologist Carl Jung spent his entire life arguing against the fashion of his age, that beneath the personal mind of each individual there lies a deeper, older layer, a collective unconscious, carrying images, patterns, and forms that no single person ever learned, that appear spontaneously across every human culture on Earth, that seem to be inherited rather than acquired, handed down rather than worked out. The very frontier of the mind sciences is the slow, grudging admission that we are not blank at birth at all, that there is content already inside us that we did not put there and cannot account for. The texts said the knowing was given from outside, and then the source was cut off. Modern science, dragging its feet, says that the human mind is precisely the kind of system that can carry knowledge it never learned, and that it now sits, for the most part, cut off from whatever the source once was. So how did they know? And this is a different and sharper version of the question. How did they know to frame their own civilization, not as a triumph, but as a gift? To record, against every instinct of human pride that has ever existed, that they did not earn the foundations of the world, but merely received them from beings who came and gave and then left. Peoples do not, as a rule, deny themselves the credit for their own greatness. The Sumerian insistence that the knowing came from outside is not a boast. It is the opposite of a boast. It is a confession. And the only reason on earth to make that particular confession is that it was true, that they still remembered in those first bright centuries, while the erasure was still fresh and incomplete, that the download had really happened, and who had sent it, and that the line through which it had come had since gone silent and dark. And the why is the same cold logic wearing its very plainest face. A creature that can be given knowledge directly, instantly, from outside, is a creature that can be upgraded, or just as easily limited, entirely at the will of whoever controls the channel. As long as that channel stood open, the makers controlled, exactly and completely, what the human mind was permitted to contain. Enough to build their cities and run their fields. Never enough to understand their masters, or to see the shape of their own captivity. And when the makers chose to withdraw from the earth, they did not leave the channel open behind them for us to learn to use on our own. They closed it. They shut it. So that every single generation since has had to begin again from nothing, relearn the entire world from scratch, and die before it learns too much. Which is the very same sentence handed down by the short lifespan, and the very same sentence handed down by the erased memory, because they are not 3 separate cruelties. They are 3 parts of one single machine, built with great care and great patience for the one purpose that this entire list keeps circling back to keep a creature that was made knowing, ignorant. That is the 6th ability. the knowledge that was given, and then cut off at the source. The seventh is the door that the cutting left ajar, the one passage they could not fully seal, the one channel that is still, even now, faintly open, and that you walk up to and step through every single night of your life. The seventh ability is a door, and you walk through it tonight, whether you believe in it or not. You will lie down. You will close your eyes. And for hours, you will go somewhere. Somewhere with its own places, and its own people, and its own logic that feels perfectly natural while you are inside it. Somewhere you experience as completely, vividly, undeniably real for as long as you are there, and which you forget almost entirely in the first few seconds after you return. We call this dreaming, and we have decided that it is noise, the brain idling, shuffling the leftover debris of the day, signifying nothing. The Sumerians did not believe it was noise. They did not believe it was nothing. They believed it was travel. They believed that in sleep, a part of the human being, call it the spirit, call it the soul, call it whatever you like, left the body behind and crossed over into another realm, the realm of the gods, the realm of the dead, the realm of knowledge that is not available to waking eyes, and they believed that it crossed over and gathered what it found there and came back, carrying messages. The dream was not random firing. The dream was a doorway, and the human being, every single night, still held the key to it in his hand. The official explanation is the one you were raised on, that dreams are the meaningless byproduct of a sleeping brain doing its nightly maintenance, consolidating memories, processing emotion, filing the day away. Meaningful, perhaps, as biology, utterly meaningless as message. The ancients, lacking any understanding of the sleeping brain, simply mistook their own neural housekeeping for visits to another world. A child's error, dressed in the robes of religion. But here is what makes this stranger. The Sumerians did not merely dream, and then sit around afterward inventing flattering interpretations. They incubated. They built a deliberate, structured practice around the door. They would go to a sacred place, a temple, and they would sleep there on purpose, having prepared themselves through ritual, specifically in order to receive a specific message through the gate. And they wrote down the messages they received, and they acted upon them at the very highest levels of the state. One of the most famous monuments in all of Sumerian history, the building of a great temple by the ruler Gudea of Lagash, begins, by Gudea's own detailed account, with a dream. A god appears to him in his sleep and gives him the plans, not a vague feeling of inspiration, not a poetic muse, the plans, the instructions, the design and the dimensions of the temple, handed to him through the door while he slept, carried back across the threshold into waking life, and then built in brick and stone exactly as the dream had shown. And across the whole ancient world, this was not the eccentricity of one king. It was infrastructure. Kings and generals and priests made decisions of state, when to build, when to fight, when to wait, on the basis of what came to them through the gate at night. The dream channel was treated as a real, functioning, reasonably reliable line of communication. Perhaps the one line the texts seem to suggest that the great withdrawal of the gods had left, for whatever reason, still partly open. And the texts are aware, and this is the crucial thing, that the door does not work the way it once did, that it is damaged. The messages come through garbled now, confused, tangled. They require interpretation, a whole skilled profession of dream readers and dream interpreters, precisely because the human being can no longer simply pass through the door cleanly and remember clearly what was on the other side. The door is still there. You stand in front of it every night, but the hinge is broken. You go through it, and you come back, and your hands are empty. The memory of where you were, and what you were told pouring out of you even as you open your eyes, dissolving faster than you can grab it, leaving you with nothing but a few floating fragments and the maddening certainty that there was more, which is exactly precisely what you would expect of an ability that was not fully removed, like the long life, but partially disabled, left just functional enough to be useless. Like a telephone that still rings, every night, faithfully, but drops every call the instant you lift the receiver. If you have ever woken with the absolute, total certainty that you were just somewhere, that something happened in there that mattered enormously, that you were shown something, or told something, something important, and felt it pour straight out of your hands as you sat up, gone before your feet touched the floor, leaving only the ache of its shape, then you have felt the broken hinge for yourself. You have stood in the doorway that the Sumerians swore was once a clean and open passage, and you have felt it not quite open and not quite close. Subscribe and stay with me, because the eighth ability is the one this door leads to. It is the place on the other side of the gate, and it is the precise reason that the makers could never, ever allow this particular door to swing all the way open again. Here's where modern science walks to the very edge of the doorway and stops, peering into the dark. Because sleep, to this day, after everything we have learned, remains one of the genuine and embarrassing mysteries of all biology. We do not fully know why we do it. We cannot fully explain why a creature would evolve to spend a full third of its entire life unconscious, paralyzed, blind, deaf, and utterly defenseless against any predator that wandered by. It makes no obvious sense, and yet every complex animal does it and dies without it. We know that the dreaming brain is not idling at all, that in the phase of sleep where dreaming is most vivid, the brain is as active as it is in waking life, sometimes more so, lit up in great cascading patterns that we can measure and cannot understand. We know there are states at the very threshold of sleep, lucid dreams, in which the sleeper somehow becomes aware that he is dreaming, and can then move through the dream with full intention and will. Sleep paralysis, in which the body is held frozen at the edge of waking, while the mind, fully alert, perceives presences in the room, figures, watchers, visitors, that feel, to every single person who experiences them, exactly and precisely like the descriptions the ancients gave of crossing into another realm and meeting the things that live there. The frontier of sleep science, right now, is the slow and reluctant recognition that consciousness during sleep is not absent but transformed, that the sleeping mind goes somewhere and does something, urgent and patterned and nightly, that we have not even begun to map. The texts said it was a gate. Modern science says, in effect, we honestly do not know what the brain is doing in there. We only know that it is doing something, with great energy, every single night, and hiding the results from the waking self the instant the eyes open. So how did they know? How did they know to treat the dream not as noise, not as nonsense, but as a damaged channel, to build an entire profession around the careful recovery of its garbled messages, to make decisions of state on what struggled through it, and above all, to insist that it had once worked far better than it does now? You do not arrive at "this is a doorway whose hinge is broken" by simply having confusing dreams. Confusing dreams teach you only that dreams are confusing. They cannot teach you that the confusion is degradation, that the static is the sound of a channel that once ran clear and has since been damaged. That is not an inference you draw from your own sleep. That is the memory of a people who still, faintly, against the great forgetting, recalled what the door had originally been for, and how cleanly it had once swung. And the why is the seam, the joint where this seventh ability connects directly to the eighth and final one. The dream gate, the texts quietly suggest, was the human being's one remaining passage into the realm of the gods, which is to say, the realm of the dead, the realm of what lies on the far side of this single life. It was left half open, perhaps because it simply could not be fully sealed without killing the creature outright, perhaps because a workforce has to sleep, and sleep cannot be had without cracking that door. But it was damaged, deliberately, so that the human being could approach it every night and step through it and never bring anything back, so that he could draw near to the place it leads to and never reach it while still alive, never arrive, never learn, while breathing the one single thing that the makers most desperately needed him never to learn, which is the thing that waits on the other side of the door, which is the eighth ability, the one they did not dim, like the lifespan, the one they did not close, like the voice, the one they did not gate, or erase, or seal, or merely damage, the one they cut out of us completely. The eighth ability is the one the other seven were all taken in order to hide. Here is the whole shape of the list, now, laid out where you can finally see all of it at once. The long life dimmed. The inner voice closed. The healing gated. The memory erased. The inner eye sealed in stone. The knowing cut off at the source. The dream gate damaged but left ajar. 7 abilities switched off in 7 different ways, and not one of them, you will notice, fully destroyed. Every single one still presents in your body and your mind this moment as dormant hardware. Sleeping wiring, silent genes, an eye turned to stone, but still sitting in the center of your skull. A voice closed, but still wired into the right side of your brain. A door damaged, but still swinging, faintly, every night. 7 downgrades. But the 8th was not a downgrade. The 8th was an amputation. Because the 8th ability is the one that, if a single human being managed to keep it, would have brought the entire arrangement crashing down. The 8th ability is the power to carry yourself, whole, conscious, intact, still you, across the threshold of death and out the other side. Look very carefully at what the texts actually promise the human dead, and then look at what they promise the gods, and hold the two side by side, because the gap between them is the whole secret. The gods are immortal. They continue, intact, fully themselves, forever, without end. And the human being, the Sumerian vision of the afterlife, is one of the bleakest, most desolate things ever set down in writing by any people anywhere. The human dead go down to a place beneath the earth, a house of dust and silence and shadow, where the dead sit in darkness, where their food is clay and their drink is dust, and where the bright, sharp, particular self that lived and loved and suffered thins out, and fades, and dims, until it is nothing but as a faint, shuffling, half-real shadow, a Gidam, a ghost, a leftover, with no power, no light, no continuation of the vivid living person it once was. Not heaven, not paradise, not even reincarnation into a fresh new life. Just a slow, gray dissolving in the dark. The human being, in the oldest texts we possess, does not get to keep himself after death. He smears out. He is permitted to go on existing, just barely, as a fading residue, and that thin residue is all that is left of everything that you ever were. The official explanation is that this is simply what a frightened, pre-scientific people imagined death to be. A grim guess, a projection of the silence and the stillness of the grave onto the unknown. But here is what makes this stranger, and it is the single strangest thing in the entire record, the detail that turns the whole bleak picture inside out. The Sumerians did not believe that the human being was always meant to fade. They believed, they stated in their accounts of the creation of mankind, that the human being was built, in part, out of divine material. That the first humans were made by mixing clay with the blood, or the flesh, or the very breath of a slain god. That there is something of the gods themselves, literally, materially, mixed into the substance of you. There is God stuff inside you, the texts say plainly. The raw material of the human being is, in part, the immortal material of the divine, and the divine material does not, by its own nature, dissolve. It does not fade. It does not end. And yet the human dead fade and end anyway. A creature made, in part, of the one substance in all the universe that is specifically supposed to continue forever, and it does not get to continue. Do you see the contradiction they are handing you, openly, without flinching, without ever trying to explain it away? You are built, in part, out of the only material there is that cannot die, and you die anyway. Which means that the continuation was not absent from your design. It was present, and then it was removed. That is the eighth ability. Not life after death as a hope, or a comfort, or an article of faith to cling to in the dark. The literal capacity, built into the divine material that you are partly made of, to carry yourself, intact, conscious, awake, whole, across the threshold of death and out the far side, continuing. The very thing the gods have. The thing you were made with more than enough God stuff to have had. And the one single thing, out of all the things on this entire list, that was not merely dimmed, or closed, or gated, or damaged, but cut out of the human being entirely. Root and branch, because it was the only one whose loss could not be allowed to be partial, the only one that, left even slightly working, would have undone everything. Think it all the way through, the way the makers must have thought it through, in their counsel. A workforce whose lifespan is merely shortened can still be used, briefly, but used. A workforce whose voice is closed, whose memory is wiped, whose body scars, whose eye is sealed, whose knowing is cut off. All of that simply produces a better, quieter, more manageable tool. But a workforce that could die and come back. A workforce that could carry itself, intact and aware, past death, and continue on the other side. That workforce could never be controlled at all, not even slightly. Because the final leash on every living creature that has ever existed, the one threat that stands behind and underwrites every single other form of control, is death. Obey or die, serve or be ended, submit or perish. The entire arrangement between the makers and the made rests, in the very last analysis, on the single brute fact that the made can be ended, and the makers cannot. Take away death, give the human being the God's own unbroken continuation, and the human being is no longer a workforce, no longer a tool, no longer a servant. The human being is a God, an equal, a rival that cannot be threatened, cannot be ended, cannot be ruled, cannot be made to obey. Because the one threat that makes obedience possible has been removed from over its head. That was the one outcome the makers could not survive. So that was the one ability they could not allow to remain. So they kept it for themselves. This is the secret sitting underneath the entire ancient world, the thing that every withheld bread of life and every stolen plant of youth and every bricked up inner eye has been circling all along, from the very first ability to this one. The gods are not a fundamentally different kind of being from you. The texts say it outright, in the plainest words they have. You are made of the same material they are. The only real, final difference between a god and a human being, in the oldest record on earth, is that the god kept the eighth ability, and the human had it cut out. Immortality is not the thing that makes them gods. Immortality is the one thing they took away from us in order to make absolutely certain that we would never be gods. And everything else on this list, the long life, the voice, the healing, the memory, the sight, the knowing, the gate, every one of the other 7 was taken in order to keep you from ever finding your way back to the 8th, to keep you short-lived so you would die before you remembered it, deaf so you could not be told of it, forgetful so you could not know it had been taken, blind so you could not see where it had gone, ignorant so you could not learn the way back to it, and dreaming through a deliberately broken door so that the one passage that led toward the other side would always dissolve in your hands before you could arrive and see for yourself what was waiting there. And here is the last thing. The crack the makers left in their own perfect design, the flaw they could not engineer out. They did not destroy the 8th ability. They could not. It is woven into the divine material you are made of, and to truly destroy it would have been to destroy the human being completely, to unmake the creature they had gone to such trouble to build. So they could only cut your access to it, seal it off, bury it, hide it behind the 7 other seals, behind a wall of forgetting, behind an eye of stone and a door with a broken hinge. But it is still in there. The God stuff is still in you, right now, exactly where they mixed it in, which means the 8th ability is not gone. It is the one single thing on this entire list that was never actually removed, only hidden. Hidden so well that the hiding of it required the taking of everything else. Hidden so deep that we have built whole religions, every religion out of nothing more than the faint, stubborn, unkillable rumor of it. The rumor that the self does not truly end, that there is a continuation, that something in you was meant to survive the dark and go on. That rumor is not wishful thinking. It is not the frightened invention of people who could not bear to die. By the oldest record we possess, it is the last true memory, the single memory that survived the erasure of all the others, because it could not be cut out, only buried. The one thing they could not take, the one thing still in you, under everything, waiting on the other side of a door you walk up to every night and have been very carefully taught to forget. So, 8 abilities. Let me lay them down one last time, in order the way you would read a list held up in front of you in the dark. Because the order is the entire argument, and I want you to carry it out of here intact. The long life, taken, so that you would die before you remembered. The inner voice, closed, so that you could not be told. The healing, gated, so that you would wear out like a tool and be replaced. The memory, erased, so that you would never know you had been robbed. The inner eye, sealed in stone, so that you could not see through the lie. The knowing, cut off at the source, so that you would crawl toward everything alone. The dream gate, damaged, so that the one open passage would always fail you at the threshold. And the 8th, the continuation, the carrying of the self past death. Not destroyed, because it could not be destroyed, but buried beneath all 7 of the others, because it was the only one whose return would have made you, finally, a god. Now stand back and look at the shape of that. 7 downgrades, every single one of them serving one purpose, and only one purpose, to keep a creature made of divine material from ever reaching the divine ability that it was made with. That is not a list of unrelated misfortunes. That is not the random wear and tear of blind evolution. That is a design. A deliberate, coherent, single-minded, beautifully consistent design carried out by hands that knew exactly what they were doing at every step, because they were the very same hands that had built the creature in the first place. You do not take all 8 in the one precise pattern that keeps a sleeping god from ever waking up inside a worker, by accident. You do it on purpose. The Sumerians said it was done on purpose. And this is the thing I most need you to carry away. They were not the only ones who said it. The Sumerians wrote it down first, on clay, more than 5,000 years ago. But the Egyptians wrote their own version of it, with their own withheld immortality, their own weighing of the soul at the threshold of death, their own gods who guarded the secret of eternal life. The book of Genesis wrote it, the impossibly long-lived ancestors, the great flood standing at the hinge of history, the serpent by the tree, and the tree of life itself set under guard with a flaming sword, so that the human being might not put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Read that line again, so that he might not live forever. The Greeks wrote it, the river of forgetting that every soul must drink from before it is born into a body, so that it arrives knowing nothing, remembering nothing of where it came from. The sacred texts of ancient India wrote it. Across the whole ancient world, on every continent, in peoples that never met and never could have coordinated, the same confession surfaces again and again, wearing different clothes, speaking different tongues, but telling the same story underneath. We were more than this. Something was taken from us. And the ones who took it are the ones we learned to call gods. When one people records a strange thing, it is a story they told themselves. When every people that ever learned to write records the same strange thing, in the same shape, with the same loss at its heart, it stops being a story. It becomes the oldest report we have, a maintenance record, written by the only witnesses who were actually there, describing as plainly as they could what was done to the human being and why. And here's the question I am going to leave you holding. Tonight, the question the textbooks will never finish for you. The one that has been waiting underneath this entire video from the very first word. The abilities were not destroyed. That is the thing the texts keep insisting on, over and over. The one detail the makers could not erase, no matter how thorough they were. The long life is a switch, and a switch can be thrown. The healing is a program, and a program can be woken. The eye is sealed, not removed. The knowing is cut off, not deleted. The eighth is buried, not gone. Every single thing on this list is still in you, right now, tonight. Dormant hardware, sleeping wiring, organs of stone that were once organs of light, a door that still swings on a broken hinge, which means the only thing standing between you and everything you were built to be is the seal. Just the seal. And so the only question that finally matters, the question we're going to spend the rest of this series taking slowly, carefully apart, is the one I want you to sit with tonight, in the silence, in the exact place inside you where the voice used to come through. If the abilities can be switched back on, then who is still here, making very sure that they never are? The investigation does not end with this video. It barely begins with it. We have only named what was taken. We have not yet found the seals themselves, or the hands that are still holding them shut, or the places, and there are places, where, in a few rare human beings across history, one of the eight switched itself back on, by accident or by will, and what happened to those people next, and who came for them. That is where we are going, together, from here. So subscribe, and turn on the bell, and do not miss what comes next, because the makers were very, very thorough. But the one single thing they could never quite take from you was your ability to remember that you were robbed. And if you have felt anything at all move in you across the last 2 hours, any flicker of recognition, any ache in the shape of an answer, then understand what that feeling is. You are remembering, right now, after everything, against all of it. You are remembering. Stay with me. The next one goes deeper.